All right, everyone, get ready, because today we are going deep into the Reconstruction era.
The Reconstruction era.
Yeah, this is a period just after the Civil War, and I think a lot of people have a lot of questions about it.
It's often misunderstood.
Yeah, and we're going to be using a journey through grief as our guide.
Okay.
And, you know, you are going to find some surprising things about how this era's attempts to rebuild the nation still affect us even to this day.
You know, it's easy to kind of think of Reconstruction as like a simple North versus South kind of thing, but it was so much more complex than that. We're talking massive social and legal upheaval, economic devastation, and a nation that's really trying to figure out what it means to be unified again.
Yeah. So let's start with just the basics.
Okay.
Reconstruction officially spanned from 1865 to 1877.
Okay.
And the goal was to bring those 11 Confederate states back into the U.S.
Right.
3 new amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th, aimed to grant citizenship and equal rights to newly freed slaves.
Yeah, those amendments were huge. They were revolutionary, but something that often gets overlooked is that some historians actually argue that Reconstruction began earlier.
Oh, right.
Yeah, in 1861 with what's called the Port Royal Experiment in South Carolina.
Okay.
And it was basically a rehearsal for Reconstruction.
Okay.
And it involved enslaved Gula populations on the Sea Islands who were actually freed almost overnight when Union forces captured the territory.
Wow. So November 7th, 1861, that must have been an incredible time.
Talk about a crash course in freedom.
Right. So this experiment set the stage in a way for Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction.
In some ways, yes, Lincoln is known for wanting a very quick reunion with the South.
Right.
His 10% plan is a good example of that, which basically said we can readmit states once just 10% of voters pledge loyalty to the Union.
Wow.
He even experimented with some land reform, granting land to African Americans in South Carolina. But what's really fascinating, I think, is that he also really pushed for compensated emancipation.
Compensated emancipation?
Yeah.
You mean like paying slaveholders for their loss?
Exactly.
That seems kind of counterintuitive, especially coming from the president who issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
I know. It does seem contradictory, but for Lincoln, it was all about being pragmatic. He thought that if you offer financial incentives, it might actually encourage Southern states to accept emancipation more readily and ease the transition to a post-slavery society.
Okay, so he's trying to really bridge the gap there.
He really was. He even proposed this during the Hampton Roads Conference in 1865, hoping to end the war sooner.
So even during the Civil War, he was already kind of thinking ahead, like, how can we come back together after this?
Exactly.
But, of course, not everybody shared that vision.
Of course not.
And this is where the radical Republicans come in.
Yes, the radical Republicans.
They were not on board with just a quick and easy reunion.
No, they were not. The radical Republicans were a powerful group within the Republican Party. Right. And they thought Lincoln's approach was way too lenient.
Okay.
They wanted stricter conditions for the states to be readmitted into the Union.
Right.
More federal intervention in the South and a deeper commitment to social and economic justice for freedmen.
Okay, so they wanted to use this as an opportunity to really change the South.
They saw it as a chance to completely transform it.
Yeah. Okay, so right from the start, you have these competing visions.
Yes.
For what Reconstruction should even look like.
Absolutely. And all of this is taking place against a backdrop of just complete devastation in the South.
Right.
Just imagine this: the South's infrastructure was destroyed.
Yeah.
Their workforce was depleted. The economy was in shambles.
Yeah.
There was widespread poverty, and former slaves, despite gaining freedom, they were facing immense challenges in just building new lives.
Yeah, of course.
And out of all this economic chaos, sharecropping emerged.
Sharecropping.
Yes.
So that system where freedmen worked on land owned by white landowners in exchange for a share of the crops. Wasn't that basically just another form of economic servitude?
In many ways, it was. Land ownership was seen as the key to true freedom and economic independence.
Right.
And that remained largely out of reach for most freedmen.
Right.
So sharecropping, unfortunately, trapped many Black families in these cycles of debt and dependency.
Right.
And it really perpetuated the economic inequalities that had existed under slavery.
So even though slavery was abolished, these systemic barriers were still in place.
Yes. And on top of all of that, freedmen also had to deal with the rise of Black codes.
Black codes.
These were a series of laws that were enacted by Southern states right after the Civil War.
Okay.
And they were designed to restrict the freedoms of Black people and maintain white supremacy.
Wow.
Just imagine you've just been freed from slavery, and now you're immediately confronted with laws that dictate where you can live,
Right.
what jobs you can hold, who you can even marry.
It's like freedom was granted with one hand and taken away with the other.
Exactly. The Black Codes were a really stark reminder that emancipation alone would not guarantee equality.
Right.
And they ignited so much outrage in the North
Yeah.
and fueled the growing power of the radical Republicans who saw these codes as a direct challenge to the goals of Reconstruction.
And this brings us to another major turning point, the assassination of President Lincoln.
Yes, Lincoln's death was a pivotal moment in Reconstruction. His successor, Andrew Johnson,
Andrew Johnson.
yeah, he proved to be a very controversial figure.
Okay.
While he did initially support some aspects of Reconstruction, he constantly clashed with the radical Republicans.
So Johnson's leniency towards former Confederates
Mm-hmm.
and vetoes of some really key legislation,
Yeah.
like the Freedmen's Bureau bill,
Right.
really heightened tensions between the executive and legislative branches.
It did.
And this set the stage for a period of really intense political battles.
Absolutely.
And at the heart of these battles was the question of suffrage.
Suffrage.
Should former Confederates be allowed to vote or even hold office?
Right.
Should black men, newly emancipated, be granted this fundamental right?
It was a huge question.
Yeah.
The answers to these questions would have a huge impact on American democracy.
Absolutely. And these debates, they weren't just theoretical, right?
Yeah.
They had real consequences
Huge consequences.
for the lives of millions of Americans.
Absolutely.
So how did this clash over suffrage actually play out?
Oh, well, the radical Republicans, they were fueled by the outrage over those black codes and Johnson's leniency.
Right.
And they actually ended up gaining control of Congress.
Okay.
And they passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867.
The Reconstruction Acts.
Yeah, these were really bold moves.
Okay.
They placed 10 southern states under military control.
Wow.
Basically, they forced these states to guarantee black voting rights
Okay.
and rewrite their constitutions.
So basically the federal government stepped in and said, no, you have to protect the rights of all citizens.
Exactly. It was a huge shift for the South.
Yeah, and it led to some really significant changes, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about Texas, for example.
Texas.
Black voters made up only 30% of the population,
Right.
but they represented 45% of all registered voters.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so this newfound political power really led to a wave of black political participation.
Yeah, over 1,500 African Americans held public office during Reconstruction, right?
Yeah.
From local positions all the way to the U.S. Senate.
That's right.
And Hiram Revels,
Hiram
the
Revels.
first black senator.
This powerful symbol of progress.
Yeah, but also a target, right?
Unfortunately, yes. This era wasn't just about triumphant strides towards equality.
Right.
Alongside these achievements came a really terrifying backlash.
Yeah.
White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they emerged,
The day kick.
and they used violence and intimidation to try to suppress black voting and terrorize black communities.
It's just heartbreaking to think about all these individuals finally able to exercise their rights to have a voice in government,
Right.
and then they're met with such vicious resistance.
It's terrible. It makes you wonder if those who championed Reconstruction, both black and white, if they ever felt overwhelmed by just how big this challenge was.
Right. I'm sure many of them did.
I'm sure they did. But they persisted.
Yeah.
And Grant's presidency, even though it was marred by scandal, did see some genuine efforts to try to enforce civil rights.
Okay.
The Department of Justice was created.
Yeah.
The enforcement acts were passed to combat the KKK,
Wow.
and for a while, their violence was suppressed.
So there were moments of hope,
There were.
these glimmers of possibility that a more just society could actually emerge
Right.
from the ashes of the Civil War.
Yeah,
Yet, as we know, Reconstruction ultimately unraveled.
it did.
What happened? Was it simply the strength of white resistance?
Right.
Or was there something more to it?
Well, it was really a complex interplay of factors.
Okay.
By the early 1870s, Northern support for Reconstruction was waning.
Okay.
There were economic woes scandals in Grant's administration, and there was this growing sentiment in the North of let the South solve its own problems.
So the nation that had been so fiercely divided during the war was starting to fracture again.
Yes, but this time along different lines.
On different way.
And into this fray stepped the Redeemers.
The Redeemers.
These were white Southern Democrats who were absolutely determined to regain control of their states
Yeah.
and restore white supremacy.
Wow.
And their tactics weren't always legal or ethical.
Right.
Voter suppression, intimidation, even outright violence became tools of the trade.
We can't talk about the violence of this era without mentioning The Colfax Massacre of 1873.
The Colfax Massacre.
Over 100 black people were murdered
It's horrifying.
after a disputed local election in Louisiana.
Yeah.
This wasn't just an isolated incident.
No.
It was a deliberate campaign of terror designed to just crush black political power.
It was, and tragically it was effective.
Yeah.
As the Redeemers tightened their grip on the South, the federal government's commitment to protecting black rights just wavered.
And the Compromise of 1877 became the final nail in the coffin.
The Compromise of 1877.
A presidential election so contested that it led to a backroom deal.
Yeah.
Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, would become president,
Right.
but in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South.
Exactly.
Essentially, the North gave up on Reconstruction.
It was a betrayal of the promises made to black Americans.
Yeah.
The era of Reconstruction came to a close, and the long, dark shadow of Jim Crow began to spread across the South.
It's a stark reminder of how fragile progress can be.
It is.
How easily hard-won rights can be eroded when political will falters.
Yes.
And those in power prioritize expediency over justice.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more tragic is that the legal groundwork that was laid during Reconstruction,
Right.
those crucial constitutional amendments, they wouldn't be truly enforced for almost a century.
A century.
Imagine that sense of despair
Yeah.
that must have gripped black communities as they witnessed the promise of freedom and equality slipping away.
So amidst all this turmoil and ultimate failure, were there any bright spots during Reconstruction?
Mm-hmm.
Any lasting legacies that emerged from this tumultuous period?
Well, it's a mixed bag, you know. It wasn't a complete failure.
Okay.
One of the most significant things that came out of it was the establishment of public education systems in the South.
Okay.
Before Reconstruction, there were virtually no public schools
Right.
for either black or white children.
Wow.
So these new systems, although they were segregated, they did provide education for millions of children.
Okay, so that's a really important point. Like, education is such a foundation
It is.
for so much progress, so were there other lasting impacts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Those Reconstruction amendments, even though they weren't really enforced for decades,
Right.
they laid the groundwork for the civil rights battles that were to come.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the just incredible wave of black political participation that we saw during this time.
Right.
Over 1,500 black officials serving in the South. These individuals, they faced so many obstacles, but they fought tirelessly for their communities.
Yeah.
And they left behind this really important legacy of resistance and resilience
Yeah.
that would inspire generations to come.
So it's this mixed bag of tremendous potential, but also these really heartbreaking setbacks.
It really is.
It makes you wonder what America might look like today
Yeah.
if Reconstruction had actually succeeded in establishing racial and economic justice.
Right. What if those interracial coalitions had stayed strong?
Right.
What if black voting rights had actually been protected?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to fathom.
I know.
But you said it wasn't a complete defeat.
No, it wasn't.
The spirit of Reconstruction lived on, even in the face of Jim Crow.
It did.
Those institutions that were built during that era,
Yeah.
the black churches and colleges, they became cornerstones of those black communities.
They did. They provided education, they nurtured leadership,
Right?
and they really fostered this sense of hope during some really, really dark times in America.
And those seeds of hope, they eventually blossomed into a renewed fight for equality.
Absolutely. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s,
Yeah.
many historians call it a second Reconstruction.
A second Reconstruction.
Yeah, and it was a direct descendant of those struggles and those aspirations of the original Reconstruction era.
So it's interesting how all these historical events connect
They do.
and flow into one another.
Yeah.
It shows that history isn't just these dates and names.
Right.
It's this ongoing narrative, this story of struggle and progress and setbacks and triumphs.
And that's why understanding this history and all its complexity is so important for us today.
Yeah.
When we share debates about things like voting rights,
Yeah.
economic inequality, racial justice,
Yeah.
we can connect all of that back to Reconstruction.
Right.
We can see how the past continues to shape our present.
It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is.
We learn about these historical struggles not just to remember,
Right.
but to carry that torch forward, to continue to fight for a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. The fight for true Reconstruction, for genuine racial and economic justice, it's far from over.
Yeah.
And each generation has a role to play in shaping that future.
So to our listeners out there,
Yes.
we urge you to learn more about this history.
Yes, delve deeper.
Explore all these different voices and perspectives
Yeah.
that shaped this era. Talk about it with your friends and family.
Yeah.
Challenge assumptions and think critically about how this legacy of Reconstruction continues to impact our world today.
Because the past is not just a collection of dusty old stories.
Right.
It's a living force that shapes who we are today and what our future will look like.
Yeah.
And by understanding it, by grappling with all its complexity,
Yeah.
we can become more informed, more engaged,
Yeah.
and more empowered to create a better tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Reconstruction era.
Hey, Rococo.
We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
I hope so.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.